It was the spring of 1945. The streets of Europe were still scarred from years of brutality and conflict. Bombed-out buildings, shattered windows, and the acrid scent of smoke lingered in the air. The war was almost over, but the true cost of the conflict had yet to reveal itself. Hidden behind the advancing Allied lines were treasures, artworks, statues, manuscript symbols of human history, now buried in salt mines, hidden in castles, or smuggled across borders. And as these treasures lay hidden, the world's greatest cultural legacy was under the threat of complete annihilation. In the midst of this chaos, a small group of unlikely soldiers, curators, and academics began their quiet mission to reclaim what had been lost. They were called the Monuments Men. It started as an almost absurd proposition, a group of men, most of them over 40. Some with no military training whatsoever would be tasked with tracking down Europe's most significant art pieces. They were mocked by their peers. Their art degrees, their credentials in art history, and their experience in museums seemed out of place amidst the brutalities of war. When they spoke of saving paintings, sculptures, and books, the soldiers and officers alike laughed at them. What good could a painting do in a world where cities burned, where people starved, and where every inch of ground seemed soaked in blood? Yet these men, led by figures like James Rorimer, an American museum curator, and George Stout, an art conservator from Harvard, understood that this was more than just art. They believed that these works were the essence of human culture, the living record of civilization itself. If Europe's cultural heritage could not be preserved, then what had the war been fought for? On the front lines, the Allies were marching toward Germany, and they knew the race was on. The Germans, retreating before the relentless onslaught of the Red Army in the East and the Western Allies, had begun a systematic destruction of art in their wake. Art collections, once housed in the palaces of Paris, the museums of Vienna, and the cathedrals of Italy, were either stolen or dismantled. The Nazi regime, under the guidance of men like Hermann Göring and the infamous art thief Karl Kaufmann, had seized entire collections to adorn their Führer's private chambers and the halls of the Reich Chancellery. Some masterpieces were stored in salt mines, buried beneath tons of earth to protect them from Allied bombs. Others were simply looted from Jewish homes and families, stolen without a second thought. The true scale of the looting was not fully realized until after the war, when the Monuments Men began to uncover the extent of the plundered treasures. It wasn't just the art that had been stolen, it was Europe's soul, its history, its identity. On April 30th, 1945, while the Allies closed in on Berlin, a small group of Monuments Men reached the German town of Wiesbaden. The area had been one of the key locations for Nazi art confiscation. It was there that they made one of their most astounding discoveries. The Monuments Men found hundreds of paintings' old masters, priceless sculptures, and manuscripts hidden away in the vaults of an old German palace. Among them were works by Leonardo da Vinci, Michelangelo, and Rembrandt, all stolen from their rightful owners. Yet the real battle wasn't the one fought with weapons on the battlefield. It was the one fought with time, with the physical deterioration of the treasures, and with the constant threat of them being lost forever in a world that seemed to prioritize survival over culture. The Monuments Men knew that, without their intervention, the legacy of European art would be gone forever, reduced to rubble, or looted beyond recognition. One of the most poignant moments of their mission came when they reached the salt mines at Altaussee, Austria, a site used by the Nazis to store stolen works of art. The mine was filled with more than 6,500 works of art, including pieces from the Louvre, the Prado, and the Uffizi Gallery. It was a shocking revelation, one that had not been anticipated by the Monuments Men or the Allies. These men had fought not just for territory, but for something much larger, for the preservation of history itself. But it wasn't only the priceless masterpieces that were at stake. The Monuments Men were also tasked with preserving the architecture of the cathedrals, the bridges, the libraries that formed the very backbone of European civilization. It was a race against time, against the chaos of war. Every day, they uncovered more loot, more hidden gems, and they realized that the true cost of war wasn't just in lives lost, but in the cultural destruction that could never be replaced. Despite the mockery and doubt they faced, the monuments men persevered. They tracked stolen works across borders, sometimes risking their lives to bring them back. They worked alongside local residents, museum directors, and other cultural experts to identify and reclaim works that had been lost to history. Many of these treasures were never properly repatriated. Some disappeared into private collections, some were lost forever. But countless others were returned to their rightful places, where they would continue to inspire generations to come. What these men did was more than just saving artwork. They were saving memory itself. In a world where entire cities were erased from the map and families torn apart, the monuments men were a reminder that what we leave behind matters, that our cultural legacy is worth fighting for. They were not simply fighting to return stolen art to museums. We're fighting for a world that could still remember as Europe rebuilt. The monuments men faded into the background, their work often unrecognized, overshadowed by the devastation that still lay around them. But in the quiet halls of the world's great museums, at the Louvre in Florence, at the Prado, their legacy endures. And the next time you walk through those marble galleries, pausing in front of a masterpiece, remember that it was more than just a painting, more than just a statue. It was a story, one that could have been lost forever, but wasn't, because these unlikely soldiers, these men with art degrees, understood something that few others did, that even in the worst of times, culture is worth saving. But as they learned in those final months of the war, saving history wasn't just about recovering the treasures. It was about ensuring that the horrors of the past never erased the beauty that humanity was capable of creating. The monuments men had discovered that, in the end, it wasn't just Europe's treasures that had been saved. It was Europe's soul, the monuments. Men's success did not mark the end of their struggle. It was merely the beginning of a long, often frustrating battle to secure and repatriate the countless masterpieces they had uncovered. The true scope of their work became apparent as the war ended and Europe began its slow recovery. For every painting they returned, there were 10 more hidden in caves or scattered across the continent. Each one a testament to the sheer scale of the Nazi looting machine. These men, most of whom were historians, curators, and even artists themselves, found themselves thrust into a role they had never imagined. Warriors for art, at the heart of their mission was the difficult task of confronting the very individuals who had orchestrated this vast cultural theft. In 1945, as the Allies celebrated the end of the war, a new kind of tribunal began to emerge, one that did not just focus on war crimes, but also on the theft of cultural heritage. This was a complex legal battle, as many of the artworks were legally owned by the German state. Having been seized from Jewish families or from occupied territories, sorting through these stolen items would require years of meticulous investigation, and the monuments men would need to continue their work long after the war had technically ended. Yet, triumphs of the monuments men were not limited to the artworks they recovered. It was their understanding that culture, in all its forms, was a symbol of humanity's resilience and strength in the face of violence. While the physical rebuilding of Europe was a monumental task, the emotional and cultural rebuilding was even more crucial. Many of the monuments men witnessed firsthand the relief and joy that these recovered. Treasures brought to devastated populations. One particularly poignant case involved the famous Ghent altarpiece, painted by the Flemish master Jan van Eyck, stolen by the Nazis, and hidden in a salt mine in Austria. The altarpiece was a symbol of both artistic brilliance and national identity for the Belgian people. When it was returned in 1947, Belgian citizens greeted it as a beloved member of the family, work that had survived war and plunder and was now ready to reclaim its rightful place in history. The monuments men knew that their role was not just to return art, but to return hope, a tangible piece of a culture that could never be fully destroyed. No matter how many bombs fell, the impact of their work was also felt in the preservation of intellectual and historical knowledge. While paintings and sculptures captured much of the public attention, there were countless other works, books, manuscripts, and even architectural plans that were also looted during the war. Among these ancient texts and historical archives from libraries in occupied cities were among the most irreplaceable. The monuments men and their collaborators were instrumental in saving these items, often with little more than a vague description of their whereabouts and a desperate hope that they had not already been destroyed. But as they ventured deeper into the heart of Germany and Austria, the monuments men also began to grapple with a painful truth. Many of the cultural treasures they recovered had been stolen from individuals and families, whose lives had been irrevocably shattered. While the return of the art was a powerful symbolic gesture, it could never replace the millions of lives lost during the war. Some of the monuments men began to question the broader implications of their work. Was it enough to simply recover these treasures? Or was there a greater responsibility to help rebuild the broken lives of those who had once owned them? Many of the surviving owners of these artworks were no longer alive. Families who had once lived in the grand palaces of Europe had been swept away by the horrors of the Holocaust, and entire Jewish communities had been obliterated. For these families, the return of stolen art was both a victory and a reminder of a lost past. The monuments men's mission had uncovered not just objects of great value, but the deeply personal costs of war and occupation. Despite this, the monuments men continued their mission undeterred. Their work was recognized in the years that followed, though often quietly and for many years. Their contributions were overshadowed by the larger narrative of the war. But in the decades after the war, as Europe rebuilt and the world came to terms with the true cost of the conflict, the work of the monuments men was slowly acknowledged. Their legacy would eventually inspire future generations to take action in the face of cultural devastation. In the 1970s, a new generation of art historians and museum curators began to take up the mantle left by the monuments men. They too would confront the horrors of looting and destruction in their own time, this time. By confronting the rising tide of illicit art trade and the cultural looting still happening across the globe, the work of the monuments men would be cited as the catalyst for many of the international efforts to protect cultural heritage, including the 1970 UNESCO convention that sought to prevent the illegal trade in art. The monuments men's impact on the world extended far beyond the pieces of art they recovered. Their efforts were a reminder of the power of culture to heal, to unite, and to give meaning in the darkest of times. Theirs was a story not of victory in battle, but of resilience in the face of destruction. They understood that art was not merely decoration, but the very fabric of civilization itself. In saving Europe's stolen treasures, they had saved the soul of Europe, proving that even in the ruins of war, the human spirit could endure. In the end, the monuments men were not remembered simply as soldiers, nor as curators or art historians. They were guardians of something much greater. They were the keepers of Europe's collective memory, the memory of what was lost, what was saved, and what would endure for generations to come. And perhaps most importantly, they reminded the world that in times of war, when everything seems lost, the preservation of culture, of memory, is a fight worth taking up. As the world moves further from the devastation of the Second World War, the lessons learned from the monuments men remain ever relevant. In a world where cultural treasures continue to face threats, where wars continue to leave their mark on history, their story is a powerful reminder. Some things, no matter how much they are stolen or destroyed, are worth fighting to protect. The work of the monuments men did not merely mark the conclusion of a war. It shaped the very foundations of post-war culture and memory. Their efforts set in motion a series of international frameworks that would permanently alter the way the world viewed the preservation of cultural heritage. With the devastation of Europe still fresh in everyone's mind, the impact of their work transcended national boundaries, sowing the seeds for future cultural diplomacy. As the years passed, the legacy of the monuments men began to unfold in unexpected ways. Their work was not just about returning paintings to museums, but about returning a sense of identity to people whose world had been torn apart. In the shattered streets of Berlin, Paris, and Florence, these works of art acted as cultural touchstones, symbols of Europe's survival and its future rebuilding. The return of these stolen treasures was a quiet act of restoration, a means of putting the pieces of civilization back together, one masterpiece at a time. But the significance of their actions went beyond the physical act of returning stolen goods. The Monuments Men played an integral role in shifting the global mindset about cultural preservation. Their efforts forced governments, institutions, and societies to ask difficult questions. What happens to a culture when its artifacts are taken? How do you rebuild not only a city, but a people's soul when their history has been erased? These questions would influence generations of scholars, curators, and policymakers working in the field of cultural heritage protection. The return of art was not an immediate process. Many works were returned to the countries from which they had been looted, but their journey was often a long one. In many cases, stolen items had been hidden in private collections, only to be discovered years later through painstaking investigation. The Monuments Men had faced immense challenges in locating these treasures, but their successors would face even greater obstacles. As the decades passed, the black market in stolen art became increasingly sophisticated, and the question of rightful ownership became more complicated. One of the most infamous cases of post-war restitution was that of the Neuschwanstein treasure, a collection of priceless objects that had been looted from Jewish families by Nazi officers. For decades, it was unclear where the treasure had ended up, till a breakthrough in the 1980s uncovered a cache of gold artifacts hidden in a Swiss bank vault. The treasure was eventually returned to its rightful owners. But the complex legal battles over ownership and restitution would continue for years. As the decades wore on, the work of the Monuments Men became increasingly symbolic. In 1995, the 50th anniversary of the end of the war, a new generation of art historians and conservationists began to rediscover the importance of their legacy. Documentaries were made, books were written, international conferences on cultural heritage protection began to take shape. The U.S. State Department, through its Cultural Heritage Center, spearheaded efforts to safeguard cultural property in conflict zones, continuing the work begun by the Monuments Men in Europe. But as much as the Monuments Men were celebrated for their work, the true impact of their legacy lay in the values they instilled in future generations. Their insistence on the protection of cultural artifacts in the face of war became a cornerstone of international law. In 1954, the Hague Convention for the Protection of Cultural Property in the Event of Armed Conflict was enacted, making it illegal to destroy or steal cultural property during wartime. The work of the Monuments Men directly contributed to this shift, as their work demonstrated the importance of safeguarding cultural heritage. Even in the midst of violence and destruction, their work also sparked a renewed appreciation for the role of art in society. For the first time, the recovery of stolen art was not merely an afterthought, but a central tenet of post-war reconstruction. In the decades following the war, museums and galleries around the world experienced an explosion of interest in their collections. People who had once been indifferent to the value of art began to realize that these objects were more than just objects. They were the embodiment of human history, culture, and achievement. In the years since, the Monuments Men have continued to be celebrated, but their work is far from over. As the world faces new challenges in the protection of cultural heritage, the lessons of the Monuments Men remain vital. In areas of conflict where art and history are once again at risk, their example lives on. The work of these unsung heroes of the past has inspired a new generation of guardians, committed to the preservation of the cultural heritage that binds us together as a human race. In the end, the Monuments Men prove that even in the darkest moments of human history, there is room for beauty, for memory, and for hope. Their work not only preserved Europe's cultural treasures, it preserved the idea that the arts are worth saving, no matter the cost. And as long as their legacy endures, so too will the belief that art and culture are not mere luxuries, but essential to our collective humanity. As the world moves into the future, with new conflicts and new threats to our shared heritage, the Monuments Men's work stands as a reminder of the enduring power of art. Their message is simple. The fight to preserve culture, to protect history, is never truly over. And every masterpiece saved, every monument restored, is a victory for all of humanity.